Thank you very much. Thank you for coming over to our presentation this afternoon. As the introduction was made, this presentation is about the perfect exfiltration. Here are a few words about this great fellow Itzik, and more words about myself, and off to work. So what we're going to talk about here today is perfect exfiltration, and this is the condition that we define as an endpoint, typically a desktop or a laptop within a high security organization, communicating, exfiltrating data to an outside entity outside of the organization's perimeter. The idea here is revolves around the strategic exfiltration. And we are not necessarily talking about exfiltrating millions of credit card numbers or health record information. We rather try to imagine what you would like to exfiltrate out of a maximum security defense industry network or some such organization. In such case, the game is slightly different. Think about cryptographic keys that you may want to exfiltrate. Think about critical yes/no questions or critical numbers. Think about closed set data like name of specific people, names of projects, definitions of projects, and strategic directions, decisions, and so forth. What all these have in common is that they are actually very modest pieces of information in bit count, in terms of bit count. We are talking here about information that can be represented in single bits or possibly hundreds of bits, or maybe say probably less than 1,000 bits. And thereby, the requirement for the exfiltration bandwidth is in itself very modest. We can probably live very well with bandwidth, with effective exfiltration bandwidth of around several dozen of bits per day. When Itzik and I started to think about exfiltration, about perfect exfiltration, we spent several months looking at existing exfiltration methods and techniques, about looking at covert channels in the literature, and we were unsatisfied by what we found. And through this research, through this reading the literature, we came up with some rules and some benchmarks based on which we evaluated the existing solutions as well as several solution candidates of our own. And we collected and compiled a list of 10 such requirements. And I think a very important part of our work is actually this compilation of rules, which we call the 10 commandments of perfect exfiltration. The first rule is something you may be familiar with from the crypto world. It's called the Kickoff Principle, or sometimes Shannon's maxim. And the idea here is that a crypto in the crypto world system, but in our case, a perfect exfiltration system, should be secure even if everything about the system except the key is public knowledge. In other words, it's in stark contrast to security by obscurity. The idea here is that for a perfect exfiltration system to be robust, we need the basic algorithm to be public, or we can have the basic algorithm publicly known. The specifics of the system, the keys, should only the keys should be secret. And given that, someone that attempts to detect or disrupt the covert channel, the exfiltration technique, should still not be able to detect or disrupt the channel. It also enables simultaneous multiple channels by choosing different keys, so that even if all other channels are somehow compromised, the remaining channel is still as secure as it was in day one. So, and that provides scalability. We can use the same algorithm with different keys over and over again. The second commandment is that we only allow web browsing and derived traffic to be used. So think about things like HTTP and DNS and TLS SSL. In contrast, say, to some protocols that are not used over the web, or protocols that are not expected to be used by a typical user, maybe like ping, ICMP, and such protocols. The idea here is that, again, the idea here is that first, protocols that are not used typically over the web may very well be blocked by some organizations, specifically the high security organizations. Additionally, even if such protocols are not explicitly blocked, they may raise suspicion when network monitoring is in the presence of network monitoring. Which relates to the third rule that says, basically, whenever there is any doubt, there is no doubt. The idea here is that a perfect exfiltration method should avoid any activity or any kind of data transfer that may raise any suspicion, even theoretically. So this rules out things like submitting to a public forum. Even if submitting to a public forum is pretty non-malicious, or can be non-malicious, the mere fact that we can hide data in such submissions by, say, choosing various certain words and not the others, or playing or toying with punctuation and white spaces, the fact that this can be used as a covert channel rules out the use of public forum submissions, because it may be subject to interrogation or suspicion. And likewise, sharing Google Docs and using encrypted text and all these sort of covert channels. The fourth commandment introduces perfect network monitoring. We want to assume that every packet is scrutinized at all protocol levels in a perfect manner. Every anomaly is detected. Think about all the products that offer big data anomaly detection, machine learning-based anomaly detection, and all that stuff, community-based anomaly detection, etc. And as well as having perfect reputation data and statistics for all the IP addresses, all the hosts and domain names, all the whois information is available, and so forth. So whenever we communicate, whenever the sending party communicates with an external entity, we should assume that this external entity is scrutinized to see what's the IP reputation, what's the host reputation, when the domain was registered by whom, and so forth and so forth. This is in fact a very strong requirement, a very limiting factor, as we will soon see. The fifth commandment introduces TLS/SSL termination, which is employed by some organizations, so that we cannot assume that data encrypted with SSL or TLS is safe from being scrutinized. We should assume that SSL, so HTTPS communications, SSL, TLS communications over SSL and TLS are in fact decrypted at the organization level, at the gateway, and inspected there. Now for a bit of good news. We do allow the receiving party, or we do state that the receiving party has no restrictions. In fact, the receiving party can reside at an organization that doesn't care about security, or even better, at an organization that supports the perfect exfiltration channel. So let's say a rival company or a foreign intelligence unit or some such. More on the good news front, we also assume that there's no nation-state monitoring or third-party site monitoring outside the enterprise network. So once a packet leaves the enterprise network, it is free to travel without scrutiny and without interference and without observation to its destination. And likewise, packets coming from a destination, from outside the network perimeter, the enterprise perimeter, to the perimeter, are not inspected or interfered with on the way to the enterprise network perimeter. The idea is that we are only concerned with the security of the enterprise itself. We are not trying to hide from a state-level surveillance programs or global internet surveillance programs. And one last good news piece is that we do allow time synchronization at, say, seconds resolution between the sender and the receiver. The rationale is that in today's internet, it's very easy to synchronize machine clocks to a high resolution, highly reliable time source, like, for example, with NTP or SNTP time synchronization protocols whose sources are servers that are connected to atomic clocks. So we can really be sure that two machines have a very, very similar clock, and I think that up to 1 second difference is acceptable. We do provide quote-unquote bonus points for methods that can be implemented manually without any additional software. This supports the situation of human agent that communicates to the outside world, and we do not want this agent of ours to have any suspicious software on his or her computer. Sorry. And finally, we need to consider active disruption by the enterprise as an option. And we'll see an example, we'll see some examples to that. An immediate consequence of the fourth commandment is that no direct communication is allowed between the sender and the receiver. Here's why. I quote here commandment number 4, as you can see, and the important piece is that the reputation and statistics for IPs and hosts and domains is available in its full data in its full capacity to the enterprise network security organization. And since the site and IP ownership can be determined, and since the reputation and statistics are available, we cannot use direct communication because for it to happen, the IP address or the site or the domain name for the external entity would be scrutinized and would probably be detected as an IP which is not popular. Maybe it does not reside in a country that is considered safe to communicate with. Maybe it will not have reputation as a host name as a very popular host name, or so maybe it will not be on the Alexa 1 million list, or even not be on Alexa list at all. All these may raise suspicion, especially in high security organizations, and there will be questions like, why on earth is a desktop in my organization communicates with this host or this IP address? So in order to implement perfect exfiltration techniques, we need to resort to an indirect communication between the sender and receiver, namely that they communicate through one or more additional or third-party sites. The third-party sites need to have a very good reputation, need to have at the IP level, at the host level, at the domain level, so it follows that they cannot be owned by, of course, not by the sender, but by also, more importantly, not by the receiver. So those are third-party sites, sites like Amazon, like Google, like Yahoo, and sites like that, which are not owned by the receiver. Before I dive into the details of the perfect exfiltration techniques that we were able to construct, I want to provide you some false positives, some analysis of existing exfiltration techniques and and their shortcomings, and why we think that they do not qualify as perfect exfiltration techniques. As you may know, there was vast research into the area of covert channels and exfiltration techniques. There's a lot of work in the industry and in the academy around exfiltrating data and mapping of possible exfiltration techniques through TCP/IP, fields and headers, things like the time to leave header, things like packet length, the packet timestamp, packet rate and timing. At the HTTP level, there are the classical headers such as if modified since and the cookie header. There's also a paper that describes how white spaces in the context of HTTP headers can be manipulated to signal bits. Like, for example, two spaces may mean bit 1 and single space may mean bit 0 and so forth, because the HTTP protocol itself doesn't really care about the number of consecutive white spaces that you have, say, in headers. I list here 3 very comprehensive compilations of exfiltration techniques, and of course you are free to visit them and and get an idea of the vast information and the amount of research that has been poured into this area. However, like I said, we are not satisfied with any of those techniques. Let's take, for example, a very basic technique of exfiltration that revolves around the type of service header. It's an IP field, an IP header. So it's an 8-bit field, so it can be used to exfiltrate up to 8 bits of data. Depends on the exact definition. However, de facto, Windows workstations zero out this field when sending out packets. So it is quite trivial to devise an anomaly detection rule that fires when a Windows workstation sends out a packet with a non-zero TOS. The fact that this has not been, that such rule or such technique is not implemented should not indicate that this is not possible, because as we said, the first rule, the Kickoff Principle, means that the algorithm is known. So the algorithm here is using type of service field. So it is pretty easy to devise a product and a rule to test this type of service field and check if it is 0 or not. Additionally, disruption is trivial. The gateway, the outbound gateway or firewall simply needs to zero out this field, whatever the previous value was, and then there is no exfiltration. And finally, it does need a direct connection to the second party, to the receiving party, because going through a third party would completely kill the IP, in fact, the TCP connection, and the third party site will use its own TOS. So it has to be a direct over IP communication between the parties, and that is exactly the kind of things that kills this technique from the perfect exfiltration perspective. Perhaps a more interesting concept, technique, is using the IP ID field. The IP ID field is used to reconstruct IP packets when facing fragmentation. And if you're familiar with what's called the idle scan technique that was introduced, I think, in '98 and was implemented by Nmap, the IP ID exfiltration technique that is proposed in the URL quoted at the first line is based on the same concept. The idea is that the sender and receiver agree on an IP address, on a third-party IP address. It can be a web server, maybe Amazon web server or Google web server or whatnot. They agree on an IP address and on a time, an hour, and a minute, and a second of the day, in order to transmit a single bit. And what the receiver does is a second or few before the designated time, it sends a request to this site, and in the response at the IP level, it gets the current IP ID value that was sent by the operating system of the third-party site. And the third-party site, in this case, needs to use incremental, globally incrementing IP ID generation algorithm. So at the designated time, the sending party, the sender, needs to either send a request to that IP address, in which case the bit it signals the bit 0, the bit 1, or send nothing at all, in which case it signals the bit 0. Few seconds after the designated time, the receiver sends another request to the same IP, and in the response it gets the new IP ID value. And if the interval between the two IP ID values is 2, it means that the sender requested something from the site and got a response, and the IP ID was incremented. And if it is 1, it means that it's just that nothing happened in between, and the bit was 0. And as you can see, this technique is actually indirect. You can use a well-reputed web server or FTP server or, I don't know, at the internet. And so there is no problem there are no reputation problems and whois problems and network surveillance problems. Where there is a problem is that the operating system, there are not too many operating systems that support this concept of globally incrementing IP ID counter. In fact, the only one I know of presently that supports it is FreeBSD. And even them, they probably will remove it very soon. So that, in fact, it cannot be used with modern systems. That paper, and I have a lot of respect for it, was written many years ago, and things simply changed since that time. Obviously, when choosing a very popular site, you also have line noise. You also have that site serves probably hundreds or maybe thousands requests per second. So in that interval, we're talking about a few seconds, there may be thousands of requests, incoming and outgoing responses, and the IP ID value becomes very, very, very noisy. So it's very difficult to find a popular site that does not serve typically content at the rate of hundreds or thousands of requests per second. So, a very near miss we have with an interesting kind of web counters. If you're familiar with URL shorteners, and Bitly is the classic example for our case, the idea here is that they shorten a URL into their very short URL based on their domain. And when you hit that URL, you get a redirection to the original longer URL. So what the sender and receiver do is they choose a URL, has to be not so popular resource, and then before the designated time, the receiver checks the web count for that particular URL in bit.ly by appending a plus to the URL. What happens in bit.ly, if you append a plus to the URL, you do not get redirected to the URL, to the original URL. Instead, you're shown a statistics page, which I'll show you immediately. At the designated time, the sender requests the bit.ly URL or not, thereby signaling a single bit. And a bit later, a few seconds later perhaps, the receiver checks the web count again. If the web count was incremented by 1, it means that the sender sent a bit 1. If the web counter was not incremented, the sender signaled the bit 0. Here is an example of what happens if you append a plus to the bit.ly URL. You get, instead of the original URL, you get instead of redirection to the original URL, you get a statistics page showing you the number of hits at the circle at the bottom of the page. And here's the problem. It also tells you what the original URL is up there at the top of the page. So with that information, an enterprise can design a disruption attack against this covert channel. The idea is that the enterprise intercepts every internal request to bit.ly URL, and instead of forwarding the request as is to bit.ly, it sends a request appended with a plus sign. And then it extracts the original URL from the bit.ly response page, such as I showed you just a slide before, and it will then redirect the original request from the client to the original URL instead of going through the bit.ly redirection. And the impact of this is that the bit.ly URL is never incremented. So in fact, it kills the whole covert channel. And the impact of this is pretty minimal to the organization. Another near miss is using the account login time. Gmail, for example, shows the last login time if you visit the URL that I quoted here, assuming you are logged in. So the protocol is that the sender is logged in at the designated time or not, thereby signaling the bit 1 or 0 respectively. And the receiver can log in later and use that URL to see whether what was the last login. If the last login is exactly the designated time, it means that the sender was logged in. If the last login was before the designated time, it means that the sender was logged in. And if the last login was not there, it means that the sender was not logged in and the bit is 0. Unfortunately, that same page also shows the last access from all devices, the browser information such as user agent string and geolocation, and Yahoo Mail also shows the IP address. So that is quite a problem because it will show that the account was shared between two entities that are not, it raises a lot of suspicion because what business does this IP address from out of the country to access your Gmail account or your Yahoo Mail account? What business? Why is it happening in a such and such hour? Why is it happening why is there a login while you are at the enterprise working and not logging in? So there are a lot of questions and a lot of cracks in the story or a lot of suspicion around when looking at all the last access information when employing such a exfiltration technique. Additionally, some enterprises simply block access to email and social sites, so thereby completely killing this technique. And just as an illustration, at the left-hand side of the screen, you see the Google, the Gmail last access information. You can see, I'm not sure, probably if you have keen eyes, you can see that there is a geolocation information. For example, it's Tel Aviv Yafo, and then Rishon LeZion, and then Jerusalem, and then Bnei Brak. A lot of places from which this account was logged into. And there's also timestamp for the last login. And in Yahoo, it's even worse. You have geolocation and you have timestamp, but you also have the exact IP address. So we talked a lot about what does not work, and it's time to say what does work in our opinion. And the principles around which we designed the perfect exfiltration techniques is that we use regular browsing. We limit ourselves to HTTP or HTTPS. And the concept is to modify the application or higher protocol state. This puts us in the storage channel bucket when you categorize covert channels. And then we observe the change remotely. This is quite similar to the concept that we showed earlier about last login time. But the trick is to find those services or those application states that do not leave anything behind beyond their own state. So there's no tracing of IP addresses and timestamps and so forth. So the first technique revolves around using or abusing the HTTP server-side caching. For this, we need to find a popular site that caches pages on the fly. I'll explain that in a minute. It has to have tons of pages, and it has to have pages that are not so popular. And I think that the best quote-unquote solution to this to the set of equations is e-commerce sites. They are perfect because they are very popular, they have tons of pages, and some of the pages are not that popular. You know, products that are not used every day and things like that. So what happens when we have a site that has a caching, its own caching functionality? Let's assume for a second that the cache is empty. And when a client requests a page, say a product information page, the request first goes through the site's cache functionality. The cache is empty, so that's a cache miss. The cache forwards the request to the application engine. The application engine generates, by querying the database and formatting the HTML and CSS and whatnot, formats and generates the page for the first time, and sends it back to the caching functionality. The caching functionality then attaches an expiration tag, an expiration header to the HTTP response, and each site has its own policy about expiring those pages. It can be, the pages may reside in the cache for minutes, for hours, sometimes for a day or two. Let's say for the sake of example that we are talking about caching the page for 60 seconds, for 1 full minute. Then the cache would, the response page would carry a date HTTP header depicting the current date, and an expiration header depicting the current time plus 60 seconds. And this page would be returned to the sender. Now, if someone else, after 20 seconds, would request the same URL, the same product page, that would incur a page hit, a cache hit, sorry, at the caching functionality, and the caching functionality will return the page with the current timestamp, which was 20 seconds later than the first timestamp, and the expiration time, which will be in fact 40 seconds after the date header. So, and this can be used by the second entity to detect that the page is returned, is received from the cache, as opposed to being generated as a response to the entity's query. And so we can use this to implement the perfect exfiltration technique. So the sender and receiver agree on a URL and a time. To send 0, the sender simply does nothing at the designated time, and to send 1, the sender sends an HTTP request to that page. And say 10 seconds after the designated time, the receiver makes the same HTTP request to the URL, and it observes whether the page was cached recently, which means the bit is 1, or it was cached right now, which means the bit is 0. We tested this concept on about a dozen popular sites. Three of them were supportive of this technique. We're talking about IKEA.com, EasyJet.com, that's a UK travel site, and Zap.co.il, that's Israel's, probably the largest e-commerce site in Israel. While this technique is of course quite effective, we need to keep in mind several caveats. First is that sites do change over time. We bumped into this. So ideally, one should have also a downlink from the receiver, from the external party to the party inside the organization, synchronizing which URLs to be used. The time synchronization, as I mentioned earlier, ideally it should be seconds resolution. Of course, the better the sync is, the less the receiver needs to wait before reading, and this is good because noise might be introduced if you're waiting too long. If you wait half an hour, someone may make a hit on that same URL and thereby ruin the whole channel. We need to conduct further research in order to measure and advise on threshold. It also involves HTTP round trip, so it needs to be calculated carefully. On the other hand, as we'll see in the next slide, the longer the time between the sender checking and the receiver polling, the more secure the scheme is against some attacks. And we'll see that, sorry, not in the slide, immediately thereafter. Additionally, what we suggest is instead of sending a single physical quote-unquote bit to represent a logical bit, we propose to send two consecutive physical bits to represent a single logical bit. So bit 0 will be physical bits 0 and 1, and bit 1 will be physical bits 1 followed by 0. This can be used to avoid pitfalls when the network has an outage or there's some failure in one of the network devices and things like that. Also, it is proposed that the sender actually for the sender to actually go through a complete browsing session involving the URL and not just hitting the URL out of nowhere, because that may raise suspicion. And of course, it is highly advised for the sender to immerse the covert channel traffic with genuine web traffic, like going to a news site, doing shopping, or visiting Gmail and querying Google and so forth. Finally, there is a potential problem with multiple cache servers, though we did not encounter it. At least in theory, that may be a problem because we may be cached in one server. The sender may force caching in one cache server, and the receiver may poll through a different cache server, and thus the channel will fail. And of course, if there are GeoIP-based routing or distribution through the cache server, that may also fail the channel. Though we did try at least one of the servers with IP addresses coming from different countries, and we did not encounter any problem. But at least in theory, it may cause problems. We tried to come up with attacks against this exfiltration technique. Here's one such attack, and here's a spoiler. We really think that this attack is impractical. But the idea goes as following. We intercept the enterprise, that is, intercepts every user, every request. It holds and delays every user, every request by 11 seconds. If you recall, we prescribed 10 seconds delay between the sender sending the request and the receiver checking for the bit. So the enterprise now delays each and every HTTP request by 11 seconds. And then after 11 seconds, it forwards the request to the web server. And in the response, it observes whether the page was cached due to the receiver's hit in the last 11 seconds, actually in the last 1 second probably. So it serves both as detection, because this may raise suspicion if by delaying the request by 11 seconds, you get a response indicating that the page was cached at the last second. It may be exactly part of this scheme. It's also disruption because from the receiver's point of view, it will keep getting 0 bits because there was never a hit before in the 10 seconds before it pulled the website. So this at least this attack works in theory. In practice, it's horrible. It incurs horrible user experience. Think about all your HTTP and HTTPS requests getting delayed by 11 seconds. Probably you're going to do a little lynch on your IT or security department. And also, what does positive mean? What does it mean that we have, after 11 seconds, the response indicates that the page was cached in the last second? It may be suspicious, but maybe not. Maybe that's what happened. It's very difficult to tell in those sites. So, and that's more or less the best attack we could come up with. Not very convincing. So we do think that this qualifies for perfect exfiltration technique. Going through the 10 commandments, how do we fare against them? Is it secure and scalable? Yes. We can assign a unique URL for each bit, and in fact, we'll see exactly that in the demo. And knowing the method and even previous URLs doesn't help the security admin or the security team at the enterprise to figure out what is going to be the next URL or whether there's even exfiltration going on or not. Number 2 was using web-only protocols. Absolutely, HTTP and HTTPS, check. Number 3, having no doubt, raising no suspicion, having no doubts. The traffic is 100% kosher. You're going over HTTP or HTTPS to your favorite e-commerce site. You look at pages. You look for lamps or linen or pants or shoes. And no one in his right mind can say that this is suspicious. Obviously, you do need to choose the site based on the profile of the sender. So I'm probably not, for me, it's not a good fit, say, to go to a site for guns or something like that. So it has to be tailored to the to the sender's profile. But Beyond that, this is definitely there's no room for suspicion. Perfect network monitoring. Do keep in mind that all the traffic originates from the browser and goes to a very popular website. So again, there's no problem from the reputation point of view. We do not have any problem with TLS or SSL termination because we don't really hide any data underneath SSL or TLS. Number 6, 7, and 8 are just items or rules that says that there is no limitation on the receiving side, and time sync is allowed. Number 9, can it be generated manually? Absolutely. And number 10, active disruption. The attack we found is impractical, so we think that it can withstand disruption. And with that, I hand it over to Itzik.
Excellent. So as Amit was walking through the perfect exfiltration technique, we also developed a tool to basically demonstrate the capability, and we call this tool Cache Talk. And I'm going to show you a demo of it. Okay. So first of all, let's understand how this tool works and what exactly are we going to see. Basically, as Amit described, we are searching for websites. We found a bunch of websites. In this particular example, we found Stack Overflow. And basically, we're going to pass 8 bits, 1 byte, using the cache technique that Amit just described. What you can see here is a very simple CSV file that we have compiled. Basically has a URL that we're going to use. Although our technique can work multiple times on the same URL, as Amit mentioned in the 10 Commandment rules, that's not a good thing. That will show a warning for a third party. We picked 8 different URLs, and each one of them, we choose 2 elements. First will be the delta, which is the expiration date, meaning what is the cycle that we need to touch that specific URL in order to mark a bit. And then we need to answer the actual bit that we'd like to mark. It can be either, obviously, 1 or 0. So as you can see, we're going to transmit the following byte. It's going to be 1, 1, 1, 1, 4 times 1, 3 times 0, and then have the last bit becoming 1. Now, because the technique does require some time syncing in order to be mindful of the time of the presentation, we actually have a demo that we recorded that basically shows this in a much faster way. So I'm going to show you the demo and walk you through each of the different sites and how it's look like. So right now, we're going to use this. This will be the sender, meaning we'll try to communicate the information. As you can see, what happens right now is the tool opens the amount of threads, 1 thread per URL. In this case, it's 8 different URLs, 8 different threads. And basically, for each thread is going to, depending on the bit, either going to access it if it's a 1 bit, or not accessing it if it's a 0 bit. The tool, in the beginning, as you could have seen, the tool is basically doing a sync. Because in a way, we're creating a modem-like kind of machine. Both the client and the receiver needs to be in the perfect sync in order to accessing the URLs and understand whether somebody accessed them before. So this was speeding the process, but usually it will sync to the top of the minute, both the sender and the receiver, and then they will operate from there. So as you can see, the writer end up reporting that the result that he thinks that he wrote is, again, it's 4 times 1, 3 times 0, and another bit of 1. Now let's go over and look at how the receiver end looks like. And again, please look into consideration that the receiver can be just any machine, anywhere in the world. There is nothing actually prevented from running on anything that is not physically the same machine. Again, running the receiver side, the software again will try to sync the top of the minute and then slipping to the next cycle. The cycle is 60 minutes, as you remember. The receiver takes another 10 seconds delay in order to ensure that the writer on a cycle of the 60 minutes finished accessing the proper URLs. Again, accessing each individual URLs, we're measuring the delta, which is basically what's the expiration that was repeated back to us from the web server, and gathering all the different results. You can see there is 60 results, mean that no one accessed that URL for the previous 60 minutes, meaning that it's a perfect 0. And when times that we arrive to the URL after the writer already visited, you can see that the delta has been changed to be 50. And that way we can tell that somebody visited that URL just about 15 seconds ago. And again, collecting back the information, you can see it's the same result. Back to you, Amit.
Thank you, Itzik. And as you can see, this code is available in GitHub. I'm going to talk about a few more techniques that we devised. One revolves around web counters, but this time we are counting a specific page or resource, think YouTube movies and Stack Overflow topics and so forth. The beauty of those resources is that in order to observe the counter for them, you do not really need to visit the URL itself. Typically, the counter resides on the page that references the resource, so that an observer can observe the web count without changing the counter. So what we do here is the sender and the receiver agree on a resource, ideally not a too popular one, and the time. And the sender just downloads the resource or not at the designated time, and the receiver needs to poll the counter slightly before the designated time and slightly after the designated time in order to figure out if a hit occurred or not, and thereby decoding the bit 1 or 0 respectively. The two problems of this approach are that some social sites like YouTube may get blocked in some enterprises. Additionally, there's a need to build a good story around accessing those resources. One can come up with a good story, but it's slightly more difficult than the previous example. Finally, there's the online status for chats. As you know, web-based chat services like Facebook, Google Talk, Yahoo Chat, and Skype typically have the online status for friends. So each party needs to open an account with one of those chat services, and then they befriend each other. And the sender is either online, marking the bit 1, or offline at the designated time, and the receiver simply needs to be logged in to his or her own account in order to see the status of the sender account. Problems that are that the social sites, again, may be blocked, and this is a bit more tricky. The initial befriending may be questioned. So if someone looks at this traffic and says, "Hey, Mr. Worker for defense industry, why are you friends with XYZ at some country or XYZ at large?" That needs some explanation, and explanations are exactly the kind of things that we want to avoid for perfect exfiltration. So this is somewhat less powerful perfect exfiltration, but still an interesting direction. So to conclude, we believe that we demonstrated to you that perfect exfiltration techniques exist. As a byproduct of our quest to find perfect exfiltration techniques, we came up with the 10 commandments, which can be used as a benchmark to to evaluate candidate perfect exfiltration techniques. So far, we have only been able to come up with low bandwidth protocols for perfect exfiltration, although we do think that such protocols are practical and useful in case of strategic exfiltration scenarios. And we present two challenges. One is to find higher bandwidth perfect exfiltration protocols. And two, to find ways to defeat the existing perfect exfiltration protocols that we proposed. And while doing so, perhaps adding more commandments and more benchmarks. And with that, if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Thank you. Any questions?
No.
There?
Thank you for your talk. My question was, what is the motivation behind this type of research? Why would you want to do to know this and do this? Because it seems to me you give the bad guys tools.
I think that the only way to predict the future is to try to invent it. I mean, this technique, we came up with this idea, and the next thing we did is publish it so people, vendors, and others can understand it and learn how to mitigate it. I'm thinking not exposing this information does not guarantee the bad guy won't come up with this idea and then nobody will know it. I think that by fully disclosure the idea and the tool, we give everybody the opportunity to learn it, analyze it, and mitigate from it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? In the back? You have another microphone?
Yeah, how did you settle on web protocols? I really didn't understand why we choose those.
So is the question why we restricted ourselves to web protocols?
Yes.
Fair enough. Because let's say let's look at ICMP, okay? Like pinging away data. Obviously, it's a way to exfiltrate data, assuming ICMP traffic out of the organization is allowed. Fair enough. But if we think for a moment about the typical, the average Joe user of an enterprise organization, why would average Joe use ping at all in the first place? I mean, that's the question. Maybe, maybe he has a good reason why to do so at a certain day, at a certain hour, but not on an ongoing basis. And definitely, it raises questions. So the only way to avoid questions and to avoid suspicion is to use regular web protocols.
Thank you. Another question in the back there? The last question.
If I understand correctly, then basically you assume that the sender needs to send the information while still in the enterprise organization. So basically this is only valid for very time-sensitive, time-specific information, correct?
Either that, yes, absolutely, or it's information that sometimes the information cannot leave the enterprise otherwise. Think about a situation where we do not have an agent, a flesh and blood agent, but say we have malware or a bot inside the enterprise that needs to communicate to the outside world. Maybe it's on a desktop, maybe it's on a laptop that can't leave the premises of the enterprise. So yes.
Thank you for the very interesting presentation.